All right, guys, I'm back. We're going to answer a military Q&A question today. And even though I don't do them that often, this is one of my favorite types of videos to do. For those of you who watch the channel and you don't know, I've got 21 years in uniform, split between two services. I did 8 in the Army, and then I did the next 13 in the Air Force. I've had a pretty fun career, I have to say. I appreciate your tax dollars paying my salary that whole time. But this question is actually right up my alley. And I've got messages and some emails. I've gotten 3 asking about the most recent balloon thing going on. People wanting to know, not 3 identical questions, but they're all related. And what it comes down to is, so we had the first balloon that was caught over Montana and then floated across the country. And then ever since then, we've been detecting more of them and seeing it. And there's stuff in the news about NORAD, the North American Aerospace Defense Command, and how they're adjusting settings and devices and sensors. And so why are we seeing more of them now? We've shot down a total of 4 of them. How are we seeing them? Why are we seeing them? What are they adjusting? And how are they recalibrating the sensors for us to now see these things that we didn't see previously? Are they all of a sudden more of them up there, or what's going on? And this is a question that I absolutely can answer for you guys, and I can explain it to you, I think, in some pretty easy to digest terms. Because my Air Force career, I spent a long time in tactical command and control, or what we call also command and control battle management operations. And some of the patches behind me are just for that. I am a United States Air Force Weapons School graduate. That's kind of like...
I don't know how to put this, but I'm kind of a big deal.
So I've been to some of the top tier schools for what it is that I do, which is deploying out on the ground and communicating to our combat aircraft, being an expert in the sensors and the weapon systems, and talking our pilots through their air-to-air intercepts, their air-to-ground missions, talking them onto targets, and making sure that our fighter pilots in the sky turn whatever it is they're targeting on, they're looking for, into basically smoking piles of hair, teeth, and eyeballs. So let's start with NORAD. What is NORAD? I already mentioned it's the North American Aerospace Defense Command. That is what we call a combined command, meaning it has elements of 2 participating countries involved, primarily the United States and Canada. It's a command that's been around since the 1950s, and they are responsible for securing the aerospace defense, pretty self-explanatory, of the North American continent. It involves both manned and unmanned radar stations. It involves men and women of the militaries of the United States and Canada. That's ground-based personnel, that's pilots, that's assigned assets, fighter planes, reconnaissance aircraft, the whole shebang, everything it takes to secure our aerospace borders. We have something we call the Air Defense Identification Zone. That's basically an imaginary line that we draw around the North American continent, past which any item, any object at all, needs to be identified and, if necessary, engaged to determine the identity and intent of that object. Now, that is drawn on military charts and maps, okay? You could probably find it online. But anything within that ADIZ and anything coming into that identification zone is NORAD's jurisdiction. It's their job to know what is up there. Now, traditionally, NORAD's job, and it's been around since the 50s, is to be on guard against incoming intercontinental ballistic missiles, any hostile large aircraft like bombers or reconnaissance aircraft, and any enemy tactical aircraft like air-to-air fighters or fighter bombers, or attack aircraft. That's what they've really been on guard for. That's what they were established to do. And that's what they're looking for 24 hours a day. That is their traditional enemy. So I mentioned that they have both manned and unmanned surveillance systems. Now, traditionally, that's going to be radar, okay? Radar comes in a lot of different flavors. And I know that radar is just a generic term we use all the time. So I'm going to give you a little real quick primer on what radar is. So we have a little model airplane here, okay? Radar energy sends out a pulse. That pulse hits something and comes back to the receiving antenna. And based on a number of things like the signal strength, how long that pulse takes to return. The radar is able to tell you, depending on the radar, sometimes fairly accurately, sometimes just general terms, where in the sky this object is, what direction it's flying, how fast it's going, its altitude, all sorts of things. And like I said, NORAD has many different radars, so some are much more accurate than others. Radars on a fighter plane, for example, are much shorter ranged, have much smaller cones where they're looking, but because of that, they update much quicker and they have what we call higher fidelity, so they can guide weapons. The kind of radars that NORAD has are what we call surveillance radars. So they look at a much wider area, much higher cone of reference, much bigger cone, so they can detect things much farther out, but because of that, their update rate is slower. Now, when I say slow, okay, it's all relative. A standard surveillance radar updates between 6 and 10 times a minute, which, you know, I don't know what you're expecting, but that's pretty good. That's pretty good for a surveillance radar, okay? That means that antenna's spinning around once every 10 seconds. That's great for surveillance, but that's not good enough for us to guide weapons off of. So when you have like missile systems, their radars are typically, they're shorter range, but they update much more quickly. Anyway, that's just for your edification, personal knowledge. Now, the amount of sky that NORAD has to secure is immense. I can probably look it up. If I feel like looking it up, I'll put in text. The actual, you know, cubic dimensions, the volume of sky, it's huge. Now, just to give you my frame of reference, okay, the Air Force, the US Air Force, most Air Forces have ground-based tactical command and control units that deploy out on the ground. The Air Force has one called the Control and Reporting Center. We call them air control squadrons. There's many air control squadrons, but you might not know this. The US Air Force has ground combat units that are trained to fight on the ground alongside the Army. The Control and Reporting Center, I'm pretty proud to have served in a unit for a while. It will deploy out for up to 90 days, no support, no help from anybody. Our own generators, our own security forces personnel that basically train everybody else how to fight on the ground. You know, an armory full of machine guns, Mark 19 grenade launchers, M250 calibers, M240s. Everybody's assigned an M16 or an M4, M9 handguns for all the officers. And so while we're out, basically right behind the front lines, providing this tactical air control so that we can have our fighters doing what they're doing, we're also defending our own positions and yada yada, stuff like that. Food, electricity, power generation, communications, all that self-contained. I'll throw in a picture of what one of these units looks like, fully deployed under camouflage netting and everything. It's actually a great unit to be in. You might also have heard of the E3 AWACS, right? The E3 Sentry. The ground-based unit and the airborne unit, they do a lot of the same things, but they're used very differently. E3 is a very capable platform, has some abilities that the ground-based unit doesn't have. Ground-based unit has some abilities that E3 doesn't have. The thing about the E3 is, look, eventually, even with air-to-air refueling, that thing's going to run out of gas. It can be shot down. It can crash into a large mountain. Ultimately, the duration that any airborne unit can stay in the sky comes down to engine oil. Cool trivia fact. And crew endurance. Okay, there are hard, fast rules in the Air Force for how long any air crew can stay up in the air and do their job. In the ground-based unit, us controllers, the folks that are actually responsible to do the air control job, we're on flight status as well, just like the air controllers, but we run a slightly different timetable. So that ground-based unit is down there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And so from the moment Desert Storm started all the way through, we have had a ground-based presence in Iraq and then in Afghanistan. So we were controlling that air war 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. AWACS would come in and do a little bit, usually during the daytime hours, and then would go home. But our ground-based unit was there 24 hours a day, doing close air support, doing pre-planned strikes, controlling the tankers, putting guys on the tanker, keeping everybody safe, assigning tactical airspace. I mean, and not just fighters, all the reconnaissance guys, all the light fixed wings, UAVs, everything. I tell you all this, number one, so you know how cool we are, but really importantly, because we couldn't do that job effectively and efficiently without our own surveillance radar. It's called the ANTPS 75. It doesn't have a cool name like Falcon or Eagle or Viper or anything like that. We call it the TPSY 75. The TPSY 75 is really old, but it's actually a really good, effective, combat capable, transportable, mobile, tactical radar. They've been promising us a new one for decades, but this is what we got. My experience with the TPSY 75, and the Air Force actually does consider it a weapon system that we are qualified on because it does direct the combat operations of other weapon systems. It's analogous to what NORAD does with its radars. It has some of the same features. So when we're sitting in Iraq or Afghanistan, every Army unit and their mother has a bunch of helicopters all over the place, okay? And when we're trying to deal with, by the way, you know, maybe 80, 100 faster moving aircraft on the radar screen, we don't want to deal with all those helicopters. We don't, that they're not under our control. We have an altitude separation. So we have what we call a low speed filter. And we can program that into the radar. So the radar is still physically going to see all of those returns. It sends its signal out and it's going to get that back. But if we were to see every single natural return that comes back, and that's not just all the helicopters, every tall tree in the way, every mountaintop, every radar antenna else that's out there, everything that comes back, the screens would just be full of garbage. So we program into the electronic mind of the radar, hey, I don't want to see anything moving slower than, let's say, 130 knots, okay, 130 nautical miles an hour. And so the radar feed comes into what we call the radar van, which is where our radar technicians will be. Again, sometimes it's manned, sometimes it's not. If everything's going fine, they don't need to be in there. But they get the raw scope, and that's what you see when you think of radar. Most people think of the sweep constantly going around, you know, old school. It goes through a processor and then into our mobile display. And the processor says, okay, our guys don't want to see anything flying slower than 130 knots. I'm gonna filter that out. And now we see our UAVs that are moving at a certain speed. You know, and again, I'm assuming sometimes it's higher, sometimes it's lower. They're going to see the light fixed-wing aircraft, the little propeller planes that we have flying around. They're going to see the fighter aircraft. They're going to see their tankers. They're going to see their transport planes. But they're not going to see stationary objects. They're not going to see ground clutter. They're not going to see radio antennas. They're not going to see helicopters. We're going to filter that all out so they can see the targets they're looking for. We also might want to say, hey, look, even if there are faster-moving airplanes, I don't want to see anything under 6,000 feet. I'm throwing that out there. I'm making that up. I'm not going to say any classified operational stuff. I don't want you to display anything to me, regardless of the speed, that is under 6,000 feet, because that's not me. That belongs to, that's where the Marines and their direct air support center, that's the Marines version of what we do, that's theirs. I don't want to see that. And not only that, this little spot of the sky is mine. This belongs to someone else. I don't want to see anything in that area either, clogging up my scope. So we can program this all in to the computers that process it. And we get what we call not raw radar data, but processed radar data. And that's what we see. And that's what NORAD does, okay? NORAD, the sky is full of absolutely everything. I mean, you have no idea. Go on Flight Tracker. It's a website one day. See just the sheer volume of commercial air traffic alone. And yes, NORAD does have to look at all that. It's huge. So NORAD also has altitude filters, low speed filters, all sorts of stuff to try to make it easier to find the specific types of targets that they are looking for. Now, historically, we haven't had NORAD looking for balloons. They have some radars that are looking very high altitude for ballistic paths of ballistic missiles coming in at certain speeds. They're looking at certain altitude swaths for maybe something that we call bear bombers, Russian bear bombers, or reconnaissance planes coming in at certain speeds and certain flight paths. We're looking for different kinds of fighters coming in at certain speeds, at certain altitudes. We're looking for the flight profiles that we know through intelligence that any sort of hostile aircraft or potential 9/11 type aircraft or anything would be executed. And that is number one, because all the other stuff would be distractions to what the actual NORAD crew members would be seeing. And number two, it's to, you know, preserve the processing power that we have. You got to remember the technology that we use today, because of the way the military procurement process works in development, anything that's on the scopes today is the finest 1980s technology money can buy, because that's when the contract was signed and development starts. It takes a long time to develop military hardware. So what has happened since this balloonism came about is NORAD has decided, well, now we have another threat, a threat we didn't really know we had to look at before. So what they've started doing is balloons move at the speed of wind, which is not very fast. So what they've done is they said, listen, we need to start looking in altitude blocks that traditionally we have not had people looking at before. Okay, 66,000 feet, and that's where the first balloon was, is not an altitude where aircraft traditionally fly. You know, that's very high. That's very high. The reason that an F-22 Raptor had to go up and intercept it is really because we don't have a lot of fighter aircraft that can operate for any length of time at that altitude, and I'm not going to go into it further than that. So number one, they had to change the parameters of where they're actually looking for things, because that's a game changer. Number two, specifically, these balloons would have been filtered out by other things, because compared to actual powered aircraft, they're barely moving on the radar screen. So the system would automatically filter them out as clutter, as what we call spurious tracks. Another thing I didn't mention is, like, especially in Iraq, when the sun would go up or come down, all of the random sand particles in the air would tend to reflect the infrared radiation just coming from the sun, and would just jam up the screens. I mean, and there's all sorts of environmental feedback and stuff that can cause what we call spurious tracks. A track is something that you're seeing on a radar screen. Basically, they're false, they're fake, they don't exist. And it could take you a minute or two of the radar saying, I see something, until it realizes, sorry, I'm an idiot, there's nothing there. Stuff that the radar would consider a spurious track, it has to be reset in the parameters for us now to say, hold on a second, we know you think that's nothing because it's just moving at the speed of wind that we have programmed into the system, by the way, because the weather patterns get programmed in, but now we want to see that. We want you to show that to us. So let's see that. There's also a factor with the radar cross-section, and I'm not going to go too into this because this can cross over into classified information real fast. By manipulating the low-speed filters, the altitude filters, and the typical radar cross-section size of a target we want to see, and clutter and atmospherics and everything, now NORAD is actually able to use a number of their radars to see things they couldn't previously see. So it's not like all of a sudden we are being inundated with these targets that weren't there before. We're just able to see them a lot better. And it's kind of like if you want to think about medical technology. You know, all of a sudden medical science is able to diagnose things a lot more that they couldn't do 10, 20 years ago. It doesn't mean that there are diseases that didn't exist or that people are sick more than they were before. It's just doctors are able to find those things better because of the diagnostic technology we have. It's the same thing with the radars. You know, through changing what we're looking at and how, they're able to better see these things. And we're probably going to see them able to locate and intercept these things more and more because, well, quite frankly, their eyes are open and they're looking for them. Things that they didn't think they had to look for before. So I hope this is a good, down-to-earth explanation of the question that was asked, which is, how come we're seeing these balloons more? And how is it that we're able to suddenly detect and engage them when we couldn't before? I love answering these military Q&A questions. If it's something that's over my head, I will either ask somebody more knowledgeable than me, or I will tell you guys that's out of my wheelhouse. I cannot answer it. But throughout my career, I've had the opportunity to experience a lot and be trained in a lot of stuff. So I will always try to give you guys straight, honest answers for stuff. I love doing these videos most of all. So please, you know, you can always throw it in a comment on a video. I'd appreciate it if you try to make it relate to the video, but you can message me. Don't do it on Facebook because remember, my Facebook thing got hacked. I have no access to that. But Instagram, you can send me an email. I love answering these. So I hope this was cool. I hope you guys learned something. I hope it was a little bit entertaining. Thank you for asking the questions, giving me the opportunity to do this. Remember that you guys are all absolutely awesome, and I appreciate every single one of you, and I'll be back again real soon.